He believed he could buy loyalty with power, but he was about to learn that the one thing worth keeping could never be commanded to stay. The brass grandfather clock in the entrance hall struck 7, each slow chime rolling through the DeLuca mansion like a heartbeat that refused to be ignored. Morning sunlight spilled through towering windows, painting long golden lines across polished marble floors that had reflected the footsteps of politicians, business leaders, celebrities, and men whose names never appeared in newspapers. Every room carried the quiet confidence of unimaginable wealth. Yet on that particular morning, the mansion felt strangely hollow, as if it already knew someone important was about to leave. Lorenzo DeLuca stood alone in his private study, dressed in a charcoal suit tailored so perfectly it seemed carved onto him rather than sewn. At 40 years old, he had spent half his life building an empire that taught everyone around him one simple rule: nothing escaped his control. Every meeting started on time. Every employee followed instructions. Every problem had a solution if enough money or influence was applied. It was a system that had never failed him until a soft knock interrupted the silence. "Come in," he answered without looking away from the financial reports spread across his mahogany desk. The door opened carefully. Amara Johnson stepped inside, carrying no cleaning supplies for the first time in 4 years. Her neatly pressed black uniform looked exactly as it always had, her natural curls tied back with quiet elegance, her posture calm, her expression unreadable. She held only a small white envelope between both hands. Lorenzo noticed it immediately. "Vacation request?" he asked casually, signing another document. "You've earned one." Amara smiled politely, the same gentle smile that had greeted everyone in the house every morning before sunrise. But there was something different behind it today. It was lighter somehow, as if she had already made peace with a decision no one else knew existed. She crossed the room with measured steps and placed the envelope beside his fountain pen. "It's not a vacation, Mr. DeLuca." He finally lifted his eyes. "Then what is it?" "My resignation." The words settled into the room with astonishing weight. Lorenzo stared at the envelope without touching it. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Outside, birds continued singing in the estate gardens while sprinklers whispered across perfectly trimmed grass. Somewhere downstairs, breakfast dishes clinked softly in the kitchen. The world continued exactly as before, but something invisible had shifted forever. Lorenzo leaned back slowly, convinced he had misunderstood. "You're leaving?" Amara nodded once. "Today's my last day." His first instinct was disbelief. Employees resigned all the time. Managers retired. Drivers found better opportunities. Staff came and went. But not Amara. She had become part of the rhythm of the house itself, the quiet presence that somehow made every room feel warmer without ever asking for recognition. She remembered birthdays nobody else remembered. She noticed when the chef looked exhausted and quietly helped without being asked. She left handwritten notes beside the gardener's coffee whenever rain ruined his work. Even the security team smiled more when she walked past. Lorenzo had never questioned why. He simply assumed she would always be there, just beyond the edge of his attention, holding together pieces of a life he had been too busy to notice. Lorenzo slowly picked up the envelope, unfolded the single sheet inside, and read every carefully typed word twice before allowing himself to believe it was real. There were no accusations, no complaints, no requests for more money, and no emotional farewell. The letter was as graceful as the woman who had written it. It simply thanked him for the opportunity, expressed gratitude for the years she had spent at the estate, and informed him that she would finish every remaining responsibility before sunset. Nothing more, nothing less. He looked up, expecting to see hesitation in her eyes, but Amara stood with the same quiet composure she carried every single day. She had always possessed an unusual kind of calm that could not be purchased, taught, or borrowed. It was the calm of someone who had survived difficult seasons long. Before arriving at the DeLuca estate, Lorenzo folded the letter with deliberate precision and placed it back on his desk. "If this is about salary, I can double it." Amara shook her head gently. "It is not about money, sir." "Triple it." Another soft smile. "It has never been about money." The answer unsettled him more than any negotiation he had faced in years. Almost everyone had a price. Promotions, bonuses, luxury apartments, expensive gifts. He had solved countless problems with resources because resources were the language he understood best. Yet the woman standing before him had quietly dismissed every solution he knew how to offer. His eyes followed her as she turned toward the tall windows overlooking the gardens. The roses were blooming exactly as they did every June because she had reminded the gardeners months earlier to protect the younger bushes during the late frost. Even the flowers outside carried traces of her attention. Lorenzo suddenly realized how many invisible details inside the mansion belonged to Amara. Fresh flowers appeared before anyone asked. Elderly neighbors received homemade soup whenever they were sick. Every employee celebrated birthdays with cakes they never ordered themselves. The library always smelled faintly of cedar because she knew he preferred that scent over lavender, although he had never once mentioned it aloud. For years of quiet observations had slowly transformed a cold mansion into something that almost resembled a home. Yet he had never thanked her. Perhaps because gratitude required noticing what someone had already given. "When did you decide this?" he finally asked. "A while ago. Why did you not tell me?" Amara looked toward him with eyes filled not with resentment, but with kindness, a kindness that somehow made the silence even heavier. "You have always had important things to think about." The words were spoken without bitterness, which somehow hurt more. Lorenzo searched his memory. Meetings, flights, contracts, charity galas, endless dinners, endless phone calls. He could remember quarterly profits from 3 years earlier, but he could not remember the last genuine conversation he had shared with the woman who had quietly shaped the atmosphere of his home every single day. Downstairs, the front door opened as deliveries arrived, followed by cheerful greetings exchanged between staff members. One by one, every voice paused. News traveled quickly inside old houses. Someone had already realized that Amara was leaving. The mansion did not suddenly become quieter because people stopped speaking. It became quieter because everyone instinctively understood that something gentle was slipping away. And for the first time in many years, Lorenzo De Luca felt the unsettling weight of discovering the value of something only after it had already begun to disappear. Amara left the study carrying nothing except the small leather notebook she had always kept tucked beneath her arm. Lorenzo remained motionless until the soft click of the closing door echoed through the room. Then, almost without realizing it, he followed her from a distance. It was the first time in years that he had watched an ordinary morning inside his own home, without everyone arranging themselves around his presence. Amara moved through the mansion with the same quiet rhythm she had followed every day for 4 years. She stopped in the library to straighten a picture frame that had leaned slightly crooked since the previous evening. She folded a blanket over the reading chair where one of the security supervisors often rested during overnight shifts. She placed fresh water beside the orchids in the sunroom because she knew the afternoon heat would arrive earlier than expected. None of these tasks appeared on any employment contract. No one had instructed her to notice such things. She simply believed that people deserved to come home to places that felt cared for. Lorenzo suddenly remembered the first week she had arrived at the estate. She had been different from every applicant his staff had interviewed. She had never exaggerated her experience or tried to impress anyone. During the interview, when asked why she wanted the position, she had answered with complete honesty. "Because I need steady work, and because I like taking care of places where people forget to slow down." At the time, he had barely listened. Human resources handled hiring. Employees came and went. Yet somehow she had remained, while dozens of others quietly disappeared into different careers. As Amara entered the kitchen, every conversation faded. The chef looked up from slicing vegetables and removed his apron before embracing her with the careful affection of an older brother. The pastry baker wiped flour from her hands before slipping a handwritten recipe card into Amara's notebook. Even the youngest dishwasher, who rarely spoke above a whisper, thanked her for helping him study for his citizenship exam after work every Tuesday evening. Lorenzo stood unseen in the hallway, realizing there were entire chapters of this house he had never bothered to read. Every person smiled differently because of her. Every employee carried some memory she had never mentioned to him. She had celebrated promotions with them, visited sick relatives, driven co-workers home during snowstorms, and quietly paid for uniforms when new employees could not afford them. She had never announced any of it. She had simply moved through other people's lives, leaving them lighter than she had found them. For the first time, Lorenzo understood why the mansion felt alive despite its enormous size. It had never been the imported artwork, the crystal chandeliers, or the polished marble that gave the estate warmth. It had been one woman whose kindness traveled silently from room to room until everyone breathed a little easier without ever asking why. As Amara climbed the staircase carrying an empty storage box, she paused beside a window overlooking the front drive. Sunlight rested across her face for only a moment before she smiled to herself with peaceful acceptance. Lorenzo watched from below, puzzled by that expression. It was not the smile of someone escaping misery. It was the smile of someone who had already forgiven a goodbye that nobody else was prepared to face. And somewhere deep inside him, a question quietly formed that he could no longer ignore. If she had spent 4 years making everyone else's life brighter, who had ever stopped to ask what kind of life Amara Johnson had been quietly longing to return to? The afternoon unfolded with an almost painful sense of normalcy, as though the mansion itself refused to believe that this ordinary Thursday would become the day everyone remembered. Amara continued packing the small staff office she had occupied for 4 years, placing each notebook, family photograph, and well-worn novel into a single cardboard box that looked far too small to contain an entire chapter of someone's life. She had never collected expensive things. Every object she owned carried a memory instead of a price tag. Lorenzo found himself lingering outside the doorway, hidden by the long hallway that connected the staff quarters to the West Wing. He watched her carefully wrap a faded blue coffee mug in newspaper before placing it inside the box. It was the same mug she had used every morning before sunrise while preparing breakfast schedules for the kitchen. The handle had been cracked for nearly 2 years. He had noticed it countless times without ever thinking to replace it. Amara smiled as she traced the tiny fracture with her thumb, almost as though imperfections deserved tenderness instead of replacement. A few minutes later, there was another knock at her open door. Mrs. Eleanor Brooks, the 80-year-old neighbor who lived across the estate gardens, stepped inside carrying a basket of fresh blueberry muffins. She had walked nearly half a mile with the help of a wooden cane simply to say goodbye. Lorenzo frowned in surprise. He had not even known the two women were acquainted. Eleanor reached for Amara's hands with eyes already glistening. "Who is going to remind me to take my medicine every Tuesday now?" she asked with a gentle laugh that struggled against tears. Amara hugged her warmly. "You are. I wrote everything down for you." She reached into the box and handed Eleanor a small calendar covered with colorful handwritten notes. Every doctor's appointment had been marked. Every prescription refill had already been scheduled. Emergency phone numbers had been neatly organized in the back. Eleanor shook her head in amazement. "You always think of everyone else first." After she left, more visitors quietly appeared. The florist from town delivered a bouquet she refused to accept payment for because Amara had volunteered every Christmas at the community shelter. A local elementary school teacher stopped by with dozens of thank you cards written by children whose library program had quietly survived because someone anonymous had donated books every semester. Lorenzo picked up one card after another from the reception table downstairs. None of them mentioned his family name. Every letter thanked only Miss Amara. One little girl had written in careful pencil, "Thank you for teaching me that reading lets your heart travel even when your feet cannot." Lorenzo lowered the card slowly, feeling something unfamiliar settle across his chest. For years he had believed influence was measured by the number of people who recognized your name. Yet the woman preparing to leave his home had changed lives without asking anyone to remember hers. She had never sought applause, photographs, or public gratitude. She simply noticed where kindness was missing and quietly placed a little more of it there before moving on. As evening sunlight stretched across the marble entrance hall, Lorenzo realized he knew almost everything about running companies, negotiating contracts, and protecting fortunes, yet he knew almost nothing about the extraordinary woman who had been living under his own roof. The greatest mystery inside the DeLuca estate had never been hidden behind locked doors or private offices. It had been hidden inside the gentle heart of the one person who had never asked for anything in return. By late afternoon, the mansion had grown unusually still, as though every hallway understood that time was running out. The golden light that normally made the marble glow now stretched across the floor in long, quiet ribbons, measuring the final hours of a life that was slipping away one ordinary minute at a time. Amara carried the last cardboard box downstairs without asking anyone for help. It was surprisingly light. For years of service, had left almost nothing that belonged to her except a few books, family photographs, and the worn leather notebook filled with reminders that had never been meant for herself. Lorenzo waited in the entrance hall, watching her descend each step with the same steady grace that had always defined her. For the first time in years, he canceled every remaining meeting on his calendar. His assistant called twice. He ignored both calls. Important clients could wait. Financial reports could wait. Somehow, without ever deciding to, he had reached the conclusion that the only thing that mattered before sunset was the woman walking toward the front door. "Amara," he said quietly. She stopped and turned. "Would you sit with me for a few minutes?" She hesitated only briefly before placing the box beside the staircase. They moved into the sunroom, where afternoon light filtered through tall glass windows overlooking the gardens she had helped keep beautiful through every season. A pot of tea rested untouched between them. Neither reached for a cup. Lorenzo studied her face carefully. It looked peaceful, but there was also a quiet exhaustion that had escaped his notice for far too long. "I have been asking myself the wrong question all day," he admitted. "I kept asking why you were leaving." He lowered his eyes before continuing. "The better question is whether I ever gave you a reason to stay." Amara remained silent for several moments. Outside, a pair of robins landed near the fountain before disappearing into the rose bushes. Finally she spoke. "This house gave me stability when I needed it most. I will always be grateful for that." "But," he asked softly. She folded her hands together. "Sometimes gratitude and belonging are not the same thing." The words lingered between them with quiet honesty. Lorenzo felt them settle deeper than any criticism ever could. She was not accusing him. She was simply telling the truth. "Was there something missing?" he asked. Amara smiled gently. "Not something. Someone." Confusion crossed his face. "Myself." The single word seemed to stop time. She looked around the bright room with genuine affection. For 4 years I learned everyone's schedules, everyone's favorite meals, everyone's worries, everyone's dreams. Somewhere along the way, I stopped asking what mine looked like. Lorenzo could not answer. He suddenly remembered every evening she had stayed late because someone else needed help, every holiday she had worked without complaint, every weekend she had quietly volunteered for another responsibility before anyone could ask. He had mistaken endless generosity for endless strength. He had never imagined that even the kindest heart could become tired from carrying everyone else first. Amara rose slowly and lifted her small box once more. "Leaving does not mean I loved this place any less," she said with a warm smile that carried neither anger nor regret. "It only means I finally remembered that my own life deserves the same care I have always tried to give everyone else." Lorenzo watched her walk toward the front entrance, and for the first time in his life, a man who had spent decades believing every problem had a solution realized that some moments arrived only once, and if he allowed this one to pass in silence, there might never be another chance to say the words his heart was only beginning to understand. Amara reached the front door just as the evening sun dipped below the line of oak trees surrounding the estate. The warm light painted the entrance in shades of amber, making the familiar stone walls appear softer than they ever had before. She rested her box on the floor and took one slow breath, as though memorizing the quiet before stepping into an entirely different life. Her hand reached for the brass handle, but before her fingers touched it, Lorenzo's voice stopped her. "Please wait." She turned slowly. He was no longer standing with the confidence that usually surrounded him like an invisible shield. His jacket had been removed sometime during the afternoon. His sleeves were rolled to his forearms, and the carefully controlled expression that had intimidated countless people over the years had quietly disappeared. For the first time since she had known him, he looked less like the owner of an empire and more like a man afraid of losing something he could not replace. He walked toward her without hurry, stopping only a few feet away. Neither of them spoke immediately. The silence between them carried years of conversations that had never happened. Lorenzo lowered his eyes briefly before meeting hers again. "I have spent this entire day realizing how little I truly understood." His voice remained steady, but every word came more slowly than the one before it. "I believed I was providing you with a good job. I believed I respected you because I trusted your work. I believed that was enough." He paused, searching for words that did not come naturally to him. It was not enough. Amara listened quietly, saying nothing. Lorenzo continued. You changed this house without asking for recognition. You changed the people inside it. You even changed me, although I was too distracted to notice it happening. His eyes drifted toward the gardens beyond the windows. Every room feels different already, and you have not even left. The corners of Amara's lips lifted into a gentle smile, but tears shimmered softly in her eyes. Lorenzo drew one careful breath, as though every ounce of pride he had carried for decades had become too heavy to hold any longer. Stay. The single word barely rose above a whisper. He shook his head almost immediately, correcting himself. No, that is not what I mean. His voice softened even more. Please stay. Stay here. Stay as long as you want. Stay forever if you choose to. There was no command hidden inside those words. No expectation. No transaction. Only honesty. He was not offering a higher salary or a larger office or another title. He was offering the only thing he had never learned to give another person completely. His heart without conditions. Amara closed her eyes for just a moment, allowing herself to feel the weight of everything she had hoped she would never hear too late. When she opened them again, gratitude shined beside quiet sadness. She stepped closer and reached out with both hands, gently straightening the collar of his shirt the same way she had done countless mornings before important meetings. Thank you, she whispered. Those words mean more than you know. Lorenzo felt hope rise inside him for the first time that day. But before he could speak again, Amara slowly picked up her box, offered him one last warm smile filled with affection instead of regret, and turned toward the door. Without anger, without hesitation, and without looking back, she walked peacefully into the fading evening light, leaving Lorenzo standing in the silent entrance hall with the painful understanding that love discovered too late cannot ask another person to postpone the life they have finally chosen to live. The front door closed with a gentle click that echoed through the mansion far longer than any sound should have. Lorenzo remained exactly where he was, staring at the empty driveway as twilight slowly settled across the estate. He had watched countless people leave throughout his life. Business partners, employees, guests. None of those departures had ever changed the silence inside his home. This one did. The entrance hall suddenly felt enormous, every polished surface reflecting an absence that could not be hidden by expensive furniture or warm lighting. He turned slowly and noticed something resting on the small console table beside the staircase. It was the worn leather notebook Amara had carried everywhere. At first he assumed she had forgotten it, but when he opened the cover, he discovered a small handwritten card tucked inside the first page. It read only one sentence. Someone else may need these reminders now. Lorenzo carefully turned the pages. They were not personal journals. They were lists filled with other people's lives. Mrs. Brooks preferred tea with 1 spoon of honey because too much sugar upset her stomach. The pastry chef's daughter had a piano recital next Friday and deserved fresh flowers afterward because she became nervous before performing. One security guard's father celebrated his 75th birthday in October and loved old jazz records. The groundskeeper needed Thursdays free every month to take his wife to medical appointments. Every page contained names, birthdays, favorite meals, allergies, anniversaries, encouragement, and tiny observations that made ordinary people feel remembered. Not a single page mentioned Amara's own dreams. Not one. Lorenzo continued reading until a folded envelope slipped quietly onto the desk. Across the front, she had written only his name. His hands hesitated before opening it. The paper inside carried the same graceful handwriting he had come to recognize over the years. Dear Mr. DeLuca, if you are reading this, then I have already gone. Please do not think I left because I was unhappy. Some of the happiest memories of my life were made inside this home. I only realized that I had become so focused on helping everyone else build a meaningful life that I forgot to continue building my own. You once told your staff that every investment should create growth. Those words stayed with me. Thank you for teaching me that lesson, even though you never knew you did. It is time for me to invest in the person I have neglected for too long. Please continue taking care of the people here. They are good people, and they have become family to me. I believe they can become family to you as well, if you allow them to be seen. Lorenzo lowered the letter and closed his eyes. Every sentence carried gratitude instead of blame. She had given him the rarest gift possible, the truth without resentment. As he looked around his study, He noticed dozens of details that had always been there, but had somehow remained invisible until now. The cedar fragrance in the bookshelves, the fresh flowers by the window, the neatly organized correspondence waiting on his desk. None of those things had appeared by accident. They had appeared because one quiet woman had cared enough to notice what everyone else overlooked. Lorenzo folded the letter with extraordinary care and placed it inside his jacket pocket, close to his heart. At that moment, he understood that searching for Amara was no longer about persuading her to return. It was about discovering who she had always been before she quietly dedicated years of her life to making everyone else's world feel like home. The next morning, Lorenzo left the mansion before sunrise without a driver, without an assistant, and without the carefully planned schedule that had ruled nearly every day of his adult life. For once, he did not know exactly where he was going. The only thing he carried was Amara's letter folded neatly inside his jacket pocket and the quiet determination to understand the woman he had never truly seen. Instead of asking investigators to locate her, he chose another path. He opened her notebook and followed the lives she had touched one page at a time. His first stop was the neighborhood library whose address had been scribbled beside the names of several children. The librarian recognized Amara immediately. Her face brightened before softening with surprise. "She is not with you today?" Lorenzo shook his head. The librarian smiled warmly as she led him toward a reading corner filled with colorful books. Every Saturday morning she came here before opening hours. She repaired torn books with her own supplies because she said every child deserved stories that looked loved. She never wanted anyone to know. Lorenzo ran his fingers gently across a carefully mended picture book. The tape had been applied with remarkable patience, almost invisible against the paper. His next stop was a small community garden on the edge of town. The elderly volunteers greeted him with puzzled expressions until one woman noticed the notebook in his hands. "That belongs to Miss Amara," she said immediately. "She helped us plant vegetables every spring. Half of the harvest always went to families who needed groceries." Lorenzo looked across rows of tomatoes, peppers, and herbs glowing beneath the morning sun. Small wooden signs carried handwritten messages of encouragement instead of plant names. The volunteers laughed as they explained that Amara believed hope should grow beside food because people often needed both. By early afternoon, he arrived at a modest music school after finding another address inside the notebook. Children's laughter spilled through open windows as piano notes drifted into the parking lot. The director welcomed him inside and quietly pointed toward a wall covered with photographs. Nearly a dozen smiling children held violins, trumpets, and sheet music. "Scholarships," the director explained. "Anonymous donor for the past 3 years." Lorenzo already knew the answer before asking. "Amara?" The director nodded. "She always insisted the children should never know her name. She said confidence grows stronger when gratitude is directed toward opportunity instead of a person." Lorenzo stood silently before the photographs, realizing that while he had measured success by buildings, investments, and influence, Amara had measured it by futures she might never personally witness. As evening approached, he finally arrived at a quiet neighborhood on the edge of the city where neat brick homes lined tree-shaded streets. A little girl watering flowers looked up from a front yard and smiled. "Are you looking for Miss Amara?" she asked innocently. Lorenzo blinked in surprise. "How did you know?" The child pointed toward the notebook still tucked beneath his arm. "She always carries that." She skipped happily toward the last house at the end of the street where colorful flowers surrounded a simple white porch. "She moved in yesterday," the little girl whispered. Lorenzo stopped several yards away without taking another step. Through the front window, he saw Amara arranging books onto a small wooden shelf while humming softly to herself. The house was modest. The furniture was simple. Yet the peaceful smile on her face was brighter than anything he had ever seen inside the mansion. Standing quietly beneath the fading evening sky, Lorenzo understood that before asking whether she would ever make room for him in this new chapter, he first needed to learn how to honor the beautiful life she had finally chosen to build for herself. For several minutes, Lorenzo remained where he was, standing quietly on the sidewalk beneath the branches of an old maple tree while warm lights spilled from the windows of Amara's little house. He watched her arrange fresh flowers in a simple glass vase before opening the front door for 2 neighborhood children carrying backpacks almost as large as they were. They rushed inside laughing, eager to show her drawings from school. Amara knelt to admire every page with the same patient attention she had once given every person inside the DeLuca estate. Nothing about her kindness had changed, only the place where it now lived. Lorenzo finally understood that she had not left because she wanted a different heart. She had left because she needed a life where her own heart could breathe. He walked slowly toward the front porch and stopped before climbing the steps. Amara looked up through the screen door, surprised but not frightened. She excused herself from the children for a moment and stepped outside. The evening air carried the scent of freshly cut grass and blooming jasmine, while the neighborhood settled into the peaceful rhythm of families returning home. Neither of them spoke immediately. There was nothing left to defend and nothing left to explain. Lorenzo held the leather notebook carefully in both hands before offering it back to her. "You forgot this," he said softly. Amara accepted it with a grateful smile. "Thank you." He nodded toward the house behind her. "I finally understand." She tilted her head slightly. "Understand what?" He looked around the quiet street before meeting her eyes. "Home is not the place where people need you. Home is the place where you are allowed to become yourself." Amara's eyes shimmered gently. She had waited years to hear someone recognize that truth, but she had never expected those words to come from him. Lorenzo drew one slow breath. "When I asked you to stay, I was thinking about what I would lose." He lowered his eyes for a moment. "I should have been thinking about what you had finally found." The silence that followed felt lighter than any conversation they had ever shared. It carried acceptance instead of regret. Lorenzo smiled with quiet sincerity. "I did not come here to ask you to return." Amara looked at him with gentle curiosity. "Then why did you come?" His answer came without hesitation. "To ask whether, someday, after you have built the life you deserve, there might be room for me to visit it honestly." A soft laugh escaped her lips, warm enough to erase the sadness that had followed them both since the day she left. "That is a very different question." "I know," he replied. "I finally learned the difference." One of the children opened the front door and called for Miss Amara because dinner was ready. She smiled toward the house before looking back at Lorenzo. "Would you like to join us?" He glanced at the small dining table visible through the window. It was nothing like the grand rooms of his mansion, yet it radiated more warmth than all the marble halls he had built around himself. Lorenzo nodded. "Only if I may help set the table." Amara handed him a stack of simple ceramic plates with a smile that carried neither obligation nor sacrifice, only welcome. Together they walked through the front door side by side, not as employer and employee, not as a powerful man and a quiet housekeeper, but as two people who had finally learned that the strongest relationships are never built on possession, only on respect. And that evening, in the smallest house on the quietest street, Lorenzo DeLuca discovered that love does not ask someone to remain where they no longer belong. Love learns to walk beside them wherever they are finally free to become who they were always meant to be. And that day the world quietly remembered what dignity truly looks like.